They fined me for parking in my own neighborhood. They thought I'd bow down. Instead, I bought the entire lot they used to control me and made them answer to me. That's how it all began. The first letter looked harmless enough. Thin paper folded with bureaucratic precision. The words, on the other hand, slammed me as I tore it open. Notice of violation. My offense? Parking my own car in a space no one used, on a piece of asphalt that had been empty for weeks. At first I thought it had to be a mistake. A clerical oversight. Maybe someone entered the wrong house number into their system. I even chuckled as I set the paper down, thinking it would be cleared up with a phone call. But 2 days later, another letter arrived. This one colder, heavier, as though the ink itself had been dipped in arrogance. It wasn't a mistake. It was a declaration. They wanted me to pay, not for damage, not for chaos, but for daring to exist outside their perfect little lines. I looked out the window at the quiet street I had once thought of as home, neatly trimmed lawns, mailboxes that are the same, porch lights that flickered on in unison like the synchronized heartbeat of a place that prided itself on control. For a moment, I wondered if anyone else had faced the same silent punishment, or if I had simply been chosen, singled out to be made an example. That night I couldn't sleep. The letter lay on my kitchen counter like a wound, its words echoing in my head. Violation, penalty. Further action will be taken. Each phrase was a chain, and each chain tightened around my chest. But beneath the anger, something else stirred. Not fear, not shame, resolve. Because here's the truth. I don't fold when someone tries to push me down. I don't bow to people who mistake paper for power. If they wanted a battle, they were going to get one. And they had no idea what kind of storm I was about to unleash. The first fine was nothing but a sting. The second cut went further. By the third, I realized they weren't just following the rules. They were also putting me to the test. Each envelope was stamped with their insignia like a brand of ownership, with the same cold precision when it arrived. Violation, fee, pay immediately. They were obstinate. Neighbors told me, just pay it. It is not worth fighting for. As if the mere mention of standing up to the board might bring about punishment on their own doorstep, they shrugged and turned their eyes away. Through compliance, fear, and silence disguised as order, the HOA thrived. But fear never sat well with me. I started keeping the letters, stacking them on my desk like trophies. Each one was evidence. Proof of their arrogance, evidence of their abuse, proof that they believed I was powerless. They thought they could bury me under paper. However, I felt something shift within me with each new notice. Anger grew into fuel. Frustration became focus. And slowly, the idea began to form. An idea so outrageous, so absolute, that it made me smile for the first time in weeks. If that first fine was a spark, what followed was a slow, methodical storm. If they wanted to remind me that I didn't own the ground beneath my tires, then maybe it was time to change the ground beneath theirs. They sharpened their tools and used them without hurry. From committees I had never met, the envelopes arrived with machine-perfect stamps and signatures. Each one announced a new small crime. My mailbox's color was non-compliant. The hose left coiled in the yard was a matter of public aesthetic. My trash can had apparently been left at curbside half an hour early. The language was neutral: violation, fee, non-compliance. But the intent felt surgical. They weren't interested in safety or beauty. Obedience piqued their interest. As if money alone erased dignity, neighbors offered the kind of advice that people give when they surrender. Just pay it. Their gazes moved from mine to somewhere else. Here, compliance was valued and silence was the social norm. I watched the way people folded themselves around the HOA's rules like a second skin, and I felt a loneliness that, hot, hardened into resolve. At first I tried reason. In the bright conference room, I sat and spoke like a man who still believed that institutions could be right. I explained the moving day boxes that made my driveway unusable, the delivery that left the back lot open, the nights when family would come and leave and I had nowhere else to put a car. The board's faces were sympathetic for show. Their words were memorized and precise. Rules are rules, they said. We are impartial. The same sentence every time. It was the equivalent of a shrug in the procedure. Paper multiplied. Envelopes, certified mail slips, and spreadsheet printouts gave my kitchen counter the appearance of an evidence table. I began to tape them to a corkboard in my study, not to wallow in grievance, but to map the pattern. There was repetition and rhyme. Every notice followed the same rhythm. A minor charge. A thinly veiled threat of escalation. the promise of further action. It was bureaucracy weaponized into a tool of micromanagement. The quieter, more destructive attacks followed. Complaints made anonymously on community message boards, a polite-sounding email alleging I had violated the spirit of the covenants, a comment at the mailbox about new people who don't know how things are done here. The message was clear. Conformity, not fairness, governed this place. I began keeping a journal, everything including dates, times, conversations, and names in addition to the notices. People assume paperwork exists to punish. I started to see it as proof. Proof that the board had adopted a strategy of attrition. Wear someone down, make the cost of resistance greater than capitulation. It is a cruel calculus. People will pay to be left alone if you can make life unbearable through small, persistent injustices. But the letters did more than try to break me. I learned how the power structure worked from them, who wrote what, who signed, and who rubber-stamped decisions were exposed by them. Each envelope had tiny fingerprints of personality. An aggressive secretary, a cautious treasurer, a chairperson who loved the sound of his own authority. Later, those fingerprints would be important because they described human fallibility concealed behind bylaws. I sat at the kitchen table late one night and looked at the stack of letters after a week of escalation, and a new, particularly insulting notice about the improper display of a seasonal wreath. The house hummed with the tired quiet of midnight. I switched on the desk lamp and let its cone of light fall across the paper. I did not feel small. I felt counted. At that point, the concept developed into a strategy. If they were using documents to wield power, I would use documents to strip it. If they believed printed rules were sovereign, I would procure a kind of paper their bylaws could not touch. A deed, recorded at the county, with my name spelled in a county clerk's font. It was audacious and absurd in equal measure, but audacity has a clarity to it, a simple remedy for complicated cruelty. Instead of using my fists or rage, I started preparing with the steady, dull tools of legal pragmatism. I learned what to ask at the county recorder's office. I learned which forms to request, which plats to read. I started to call title companies, pretending to be a neighbor considering development. I scheduled a meeting with a retired surveyor who would answer 3 questions for a reasonable fee and an excellent lunch. I became more convinced with each piece of data I gathered that ownership was a very small factor with a significant impact. The idea grew less fantastical with every record I unearthed. A laver might be a parking lot somewhere in the municipal limbo. A signature, a stamp, or an entry in the ledger could end their small empire. I knew then that the battle ahead would not be won in a single shout in a boardroom. It would be won slowly as requests were filed, emails were sent, and funds were wired in a quiet, tedious manner. It would be legal and logistical. I didn't think I had the patience, money, or boredom tolerance necessary for this. When the next fine slipped under my door, this time for an alleged violation of a landscaping schedule I didn't even know existed, I smiled without humor. The sting remained, but it had been transformed into something else, fuel. After straightening the label, I pinned the notice to the corkboard. The map was growing. The storm had a direction. It wasn't one single letter that pushed me over the edge. It was the accumulation, the steady drip of control that became a flood. The morning it happened, I was already late for work. I walked out, coffee in hand, only to find a bright orange slip taped to my front door like a public shaming notice. Final warning. 3 bold words that burned hotter than the summer sun. I ripped it apart, folded it up, and put it in my pocket. However, when I opened my mailbox, I found yet another letter waiting. A different blow came with this one. If you don't comply, you could face legal action, including a lien on your property. A lien on my home. Concerned parking. That was when my stomach turned cold. They were no longer just playing games. They were posing a threat to the roof over my head, which I thought was safe. That night I walked into the board's monthly meeting. The room was too bright, too sterile, filled with people who smelled faintly of smug certainty. I took a seat in the back, hands gripping the armrests, pulse heavy in my throat. When my name was called, I stood. I said, my voice echoing louder than I expected, "I want to understand. Why are you focusing on me? Why these fines?" The head of the board leaned back, adjusting his glasses like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. His voice was composed, practiced, and cocky. He added, "Maybe you should think about selling your house if you don't like it. This neighborhood isn't for everyone." The room tilted. Time slowed down. His words landed with the weight of a verdict. "Get your home sold," as if I had no place there. As if I was nothing more than an intruder on land they thought they owned. I left the meeting in silence, but my mind was loud, screaming, seething, calculating. The night air felt sharp in my lungs as I walked back to my house. I realized then that reason would never work with people who thrived on power. I could fight fines and appeal notices for years until my hair turned gray, and nothing would change. No. If I wanted to end this war, I had to flip the battlefield. That was the night the plan truly crystallized. I didn't just want to respond negatively. I wanted to make the ground they were standing on my own. And from that moment forward, I stopped being their victim. I became their problem. Revenge, I learned, doesn't arrive in a single roar. It arrives in footnotes, in county clerk signatures, in long afternoons bent over maps while the rest of the world eats and sleeps. After the board's thin, patronizing line, "Perhaps you should sell your house," my anger did not scream. It was clear. It narrowed into a quiet, terrible sort of clarity. In the beginning, I treated the neighborhood as evidence. The boring, patient work of someone who intends to win on paper, not the theatrics of righteous rage. I compiled lists. I learned the names of plats and easements. I learned how to read a legal description without letting the dense sentences make me dizzy. At the county recorder's office, I became indescribable because the man behind the counter knew my voice like a bartender knows a regular's order. He stopped giving me puzzled looks and started sliding ledgers across the counter with a resigned efficiency. There were nights when the house went dark and I sat under the study lamp, a map spread like a battleground, coffee gone cold at my elbow. I traced lines with my finger, followed the ribbons of easements, circled common area in red, and tried to find the seams where authority frayed. Authority often hides in the comfortable language of covenants and bylaws. Those are the things people sign without reading. But deeds, a recorded deed with a county stamp, are stubborn facts. They don't care about meetings or whispered opinions. They exist. I pretended to be a developer conducting reconnaissance when I called title companies. I asked stupid questions and then smarter ones. I paid for records I could have found for free, because sometimes the cost of data is worth the way it makes others take you seriously. I hired a retired surveyor for breakfast and honest conversation. He pointed out a small sentence in an old developer's plat that said the lot was subject to future conveyance, which was missing from the recorded easement. To everyone at the time it was a note. To me it read like a door left ajar. The deeper I dug, the less mythical the HOA looked. They were a committee, not a sovereign. Their bylaws granted them management authority over certain common areas, but management and ownership are different legal animals. You are able to control the space you own, but you are unable to hide from public records that state otherwise. Once the idea formed, everything I did after that was to translate it into a way to hold a deed. Cash, escrow, recorded title. I carefully and slowly put together a team. A paralegal who liked coffee and spreadsheets. A young real estate lawyer who charged for minutes but thought my plan was clever. An accountant who told me bluntly what I could and could not afford. Retribution was not spontaneous, as many believed. It required other people's expertise. It required humility, admitting where I needed help and paying for it. There were issues with the practical. If the lot had multiple claims, I might be dragged into litigation. I would have to bargain if a bank had a lien. If the HOA challenged the recording, we'd file a quiet title action and fight to make the record reflect reality. Each of these possibilities had cost attached. Legal fees, survey costs, filing fees. I rebalanced my life. Payday loans weren't on the table. This was a long game, and I arranged my finances like a patient investor rather than a gambler. The first move was the simplest. Find the seller. The parcel had once been part of the developer's amenity plan. Developers sell lots, merge holdings, shutter shell companies. I found one such company's name, a company that had been dormant for a long time but appeared to have a technical interest on paper. Their representative answered after 2 polite emails. Miscommunication and bureaucracy can be allies. They delay the motivated and reward the persistent. Negotiation was anticlimactic. The seller wanted a clean break, a price, a quick close, and a release of any latent claims. I offered a figure that made sense for my budget, but threatened to make theirs an accounting problem if they walked away. The lawyer smiled at the way I structured the offer. Enough cash to be tempting, contingencies tight enough to make a slow, messy fight expensive. Certainty can be a currency more valuable than money. I made them believe the deal would be fast. They accepted. When the escrow packet arrived, I felt the twitch of something that was almost holy. Escrow instructions, closing disclosures. These were the back alleys of property law. Practical documents no one thinks about until they matter. I answered the notary's oath, signed documents, and wired money. The notary asked me to swear that everything I had signed was true to my knowledge. In the small, windowless room, paper and ink felt like tools and promises at once. A recorded deed serves as both a legal document and a communication. It says I own this. It is listed in a county database that does not care for social status or well-polished speeches. A place on the public ledger that transforms whatever is written there into a public fact is the mundane and absolute county recorder's stamp. When the deed posted, the feeling was immediate and strange. A portion of me had anticipated phone calls, threats, and a midnight knock as fireworks. Instead, the world reconfigured with a click, quiet and unromantic. The HOA sent its usual petty notices the next week, like a dog continuing to bark after the fence has been moved. I kept each envelope and pinned them beside the recorded deed, an odd shrine of cause and effect. I called an attorney not to plot revenge, but to understand the limitations of my power. Owning the lot would not magically make the board vanish from their lives or strip them of their homes. It would give me legal leverage. It would give the community a new set of facts to reckon with. Rights to control access, negotiate terms, and deny use came with title. Ownership is not cruelty unless you choose to make it so. That choice, what to do with the leverage, came later. For now the plan had worked in its primary purpose. It had replaced anxiety with a path forward. It had turned fear into tasks and letters into evidence. Each step was dull and exacting. Calls to title, meals with surveyors, signatures in office chairs. Each small victory felt disproportionate simply because the stakes were the ceiling of my home, and the idea of being humiliated by people who had never earned the right to judge me. I sat at my kitchen table one late night and spread the title report, next to the stack of notices after confirmation of recording, and the soft ding of an email that said, "Recorded." The deeds pages felt cool under my fingers. I thought about the men and women who had sent those first fines, the head of the board who'd suggested I sell my house, the neighbors who had shrunk from conflict. This wasn't about spectacle, so there was no childish joy in me. It was what I had decided justice would look like for me. A small, lawful correction to a wrong that had become a system. The plan had been to pry open a seam in their authority using the least melodramatic instrument I could find, a legal deed. The effect, when it came, was part vindication, part demonstration. It demonstrated a straightforward fact: rules that lack accountability lead to abuse. And when you take the time to read the small print, to walk the county recorder's hall, and to pay for expertise, sometimes the law is on your side. With title in hand, the next phase, public confrontation and the test of wills at a board meeting, was no longer fantasy. It was procedural. It was a first step along a path. The lot was no longer a background detail. It was the fulcrum on which the next act would turn. I felt ready, not because I'd won, but because I had a lever and the patience to pull it. The slow fuse had been lit. The plan, clinical and patient, moved toward execution. And for the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking from the sound of an envelope dropping on my porch. Closing day arrived like a scene someone else had written for me, small, bureaucratic, and oddly sacred. I dressed in something neutral, nothing ostentatious. The fight I was waging didn't need a costume. I drove to the title company with a folder of confirmations, pre-approval letters, and a strange calm lodged behind my ribs. The sky was flat and honest that morning, the kind of light that makes paper look official. The office smelled of coffee and printer toner. A woman with a practiced smile led me into a small conference room where the deed lay waiting like an accusation about to be rewritten. The pages were dense with legal description. Property lines measured in feet, bearings, references to monuments and markers. Words that had the power to change the arrangement of people's lives. I heard the low hum of something that could never be changed as I ran my thumb along the edge. The seller's representative arrived late, weary and efficient. He had the look of a man whose days involved moving numbers between columns and keeping his conscience neutral. His lawyer sat across from me, polite and guarded. The notary cleared her throat and asked the usual questions. Identity verified, intent confirmed. The oath read in a voice that made what we were doing sound ordinary when it really wasn't. Signing a deed is both mundane and intimate. My signature on that page was not a flourish, but a small, stubborn fact. It said, "I will stand by this. This will cost me money. I will be responsible for this." The notary's stamp thudded down with a dry finality. and the attorney slid the stack of papers toward me as if to say, "Congratulations," though her voice carried no triumph, only the professional cadence of someone who had seen dozens of transactions like this one. There's an odd hush after legal things are done. The world waits until the clerk files the record before rearranging itself. I walked out of the office clutching what felt like a talisman: photocopies, receipts, the original deed snug in a folder. I sent the wire transfer from my phone in the car. The money left my account with a small, irrevocable click. The county recorder's office is not dramatic. It is a machine built to make facts permanent. The document was scanned, stamped by the clerk, and then added to the public ledger. My name, the parcel, and the recorded number were all updated in a line on the county website like a small miracle. Absolute and bureaucratic it was. My claim to that ground had graduated from paper to public record. When I held the recorded deed in my hands for the first time, the sensation wasn't fireworks. It was a slow, steady settling, like setting a stone into place and feeling the foundation shift. Imperceptible but real. I brought the wet-stamped pages back to my house and set them on the kitchen table next to the pile of notices of violations. The contrast felt poetic. Petty envelopes beside the county's stamp, their tiny threats dwarfed by the recorder's seal. They kept sending letters. Habit dies slowly. A violation for a garden ornament appeared a week later, signed by the same chair who had told me to sell my home. I opened it with a little amusement. Then I turned to the deed and reread the line that named me as owner of Parcel A, the rear parking lot. Ownership gives you options. It does not imply that you behave in a dictatorial manner. Rather, it indicates that you are able to make decisions that are legally binding. I called a real estate attorney, not to brag, not to threaten, but to understand the shape and edges of my new rights. He explained the practicalities to me, including title, easements, rights to exclude, and the obstacles posed by local regulations. There were limits, of course. Owning the lot didn't entitle me to kick neighbors out of their houses or to remove the board overnight. What it did give me was leverage. The ability to negotiate access, to set fair terms, to stop weaponized enforcement that had nothing to do with safety or community welfare. There were quieter choices to be made, too. I could make this about humiliation and make them pay in public spectacle. Or I could make this about changing the system and breaking the pattern so that someone else doesn't have to fight like I did. Moral weight and consequences accompanied each option. I thought of the elderly neighbors who relied on the board for reasonable services. I thought of the single mom who always parked in the back lot because she worked nights. Retribution tasted good in the mind, but justice felt more useful. Still, the first taste of control was heady. When the board's chair sent a terse email demanding a meeting to discuss perceived discrepancies, I replied with calm facts and an invitation to negotiate publicly. He did not expect a composed answer. He expected threats, shouting, or silent capitulation. Procedure and the public record were his. Word travels fast in small communities. Neighbors were asking questions by the weekend. "Can we continue to use the lot?" Asked one email. "Will there be fees?" Asked another. I answered openly. I intended to work with the community. I wanted fair access. I wanted to end the pattern of using fines to intimidate. But I would not allow the board to weaponize bylaws and secrecy anymore. There was pushback. The board lawyer fired a terse letter outlining management rights and implying a potential challenge to the recording. That's bureaucracy's favorite pastime. Delay. However, delay is not the same as denying. The deed had been legally recorded. Overturning that record would be costly in public. If they sued, it would be their choice first to escalate. I'd built my plan expecting resistance. I had the funds set aside for defense and the attorney lined up to respond. For now, the world had shifted by the width of an inked stamp. The chair and his allies now had to contend with a public fact. Someone else owned a patch of what they'd treated like unquestioned turf. It rattled them more than any warning letter ever could. That night, I walked past the community center and glanced at the lot that had once been the site of petty enforcement. A few cars sat there, neighbors unaware how close to a keystone they were parked. The asphalt looked the same. The lights glowed the same. But everything about it felt different. There is a peculiar satisfaction in converting a threat into a tool that can be used to build, rather than merely to retaliate. I slept better than I had in months. The deed was not vengeance in ink. It was a lever. The next chapter would not be a shout, but a negotiation. I had stolen back a piece of my peace through the dry arithmetic of law. It was unusual and possibly ugly and entirely effective. They scheduled the board meeting for a Tuesday evening, the kind of time that guarantees faces in chairs. people who like the work of governance with the safety of routine. The community center smelled of lemon cleaner and old coffee. Folding chairs clicked like metronomes. Nameplates lined the table, each a small declaration of control. I arrived early and sat near the back, the recorded deed folded into my jacket like a secret that had been waiting for its moment. The meeting began as usual. Approval of the minutes, reading of the treasurer's report, in a tone that was taken seriously, and discussion of landscaping contractors. Small things, performed on a stage, while the real business of power got done in the gaps. I watched the board members move with the brittle grace of people who had rehearsed authority until it felt natural. They still believed that the performance of governance equaled possession. When it was time for public comments, the room shifted. People stood and spoke. A complaint about the pool gate. Thanks for a recent repair. Normal neighborhood cadence. Then my name was called. I stood, walked to the lectern, and let the quiet in the room tighten around me like a lens. I set the deed down where everyone could see the county's stamp and my name spelled in that indifferent official font. The paper seemed ordinary. That ordinariness was the point. "Good evening," I said. "My name is—" I paused so the syllables could sit like facts. "And I'd like to share something with everyone here." A few heads turned. The chair leaned forward with the practiced expression of a man who expected theatrics he could dismiss. "State your concern," he said. The words pried from his mouth like an instruction. I laid the recorded deed flat and let the fluorescent light catch the county stamp. "This parcel behind the community center," I said, "is recorded in my name as of 3 days ago." I heard the words as plainly as if I had read them from a script. The room inhaled. For a second there was disbelief, then a ripple. Murmurs, the shuffle of papers, the quick glance of someone scanning their phone. The chair rigidified. The smile he'd worn in my face-to-face meeting vanished like a prop. He attempted the old move. Chuckle, deflection. "There must be an error," he said. "The lot is a common area managed by the HOA. "You manage it?" I replied, voice steady. "You do not own it. It has been recorded with the county. I purchased the parcel legally and paid for it. I'm here to be transparent about that fact." I slid copies of the title report and chain of conveyance across the lectern. The papers were quiet evidence. They did the work of humiliation without spectacle. Faces in the room changed in small increments: surprise, confusion, anger, calculation. The chair's expression went from practiced civility to something thinner, more brittle. A board member fumbled with a binder, scanning bylaws as if a paragraph might undo a recorded deed. It won't, of course. Convenience doesn't matter to law. Record cares for it. "You can contest the recording," the chair said finally, the words forced. "If there are discrepancies, we'll pursue legal remedies." "Contest all you like," I said. "If you want to spend the money of the community, contesting is the way to go. Alternatively, we can negotiate viable solutions." I kept my tone even. I didn't want to make things worse than they needed to be. Public humiliation was not the point. Correction was. "Does this mean we can still use the lot?" A member of the audience asked, half unsure and half hopeful. Another voice worried about parking for elderly visitors. These were real problems that didn't deserve to be solved by petty power plays. That was the crux. The board's abuses had real victims. Neighbors forced to pay fines. Caregivers left scrambling. Families shamed into silence. "What I propose," I said, "is simple. I will work with the community to provide reasonable access and fair terms. But I will not tolerate the use of the lot as leverage for fines and intimidation. If the board persists in weaponizing rules to target residents, I will exercise my rights as owner." I spoke the words with the calm of someone who had prepared for every eventual legal reply. The chair's rebuttal was procedural and thin. He promised to consult counsel and to provide a response. Counsel in the world of bureaucracy is often a delay tactic. I had anticipated that. I had my lawyer's contact details ready, my own list of facts pinned to the table. The room splintered into a dozen small conversations. Neighbors weighing the prospect of a drawn-out legal fight, a few who felt vindicated, others who feared escalation. After the meeting adjourned, the board lingered. They clustered in a quiet knot, a defensive formation. The chair spoke to his attorney in low tones. I caught phrases: re-recording, challenge, community vote. They had to map a path forward in real time. For months, they had controlled the narrative through notices and the assumption that no one would push back. Now narrative met public record. Outside, people stopped me with questions and offers of thanks. An older woman from down the street hugged me and whispered, Finally. A young father asked if his night shift wife could have a permit to park in the lot. These small human moments grounded the legal drama. This wasn't about ego. It was about making the community livable again. Back home that night, I spread out a copy of the meeting notes beside the deed. The board could respond with lawsuits and motions, but every dispute would be public. Their actions would no longer hide behind mailed envelopes and anonymous complaints. The record now had two sides, their bylaws and the county's deed. People tend to trust what's visible. Within days, the chair wrote a formal letter requesting a meeting and insisting on mediation. His tone attempted to regain authority through method. It was a message both to me and to the community. We can still run things the way we like. I replied with a public invitation to meet in an open session and to include a neutral mediator. After all, transparency reduces the benefits of secret enforcement. His lawyers counseled caution. His allies counseled aggression. The fissure widened. Some board members argued for negotiation. Others wanted to test a legal challenge. There's a certain desperation when power starts to slip. People will gamble the association's funds to try to hold on. Word spread beyond our cul-de-sac. A local community forum buzzed. The neighborhood's private social feed filled with speculation and commentary. Opinions ranged from triumph to terror. The story had become, absurdly, both a local morality play and a lesson in civic literacy. Read your deeds. Understand your records. Don't assume committees are omniscient. The showdown at the meeting had not ended the conflict. It had exposed it. It had forced the HOA to act in daylight, to choose between transparency and litigation, between negotiation and spectacle. For me, the goal wasn't to humiliate, though I admit some part of me relished the shift in posture from their smugness to unease. The goal was to dismantle a little machine of petty tyranny and to replace it with something functionally fair. In the days that followed, the community watched. Board emails grew more formal. I later learned that while the chair's public statements were cautious, his private ones were frantic. Meetings that once ran like clockwork now included nervous silence and heavy-handed minutes. They attempted to reassert control through motion votes and legal threats. I answered with calm facts, with offers for mediated sessions, and with an insistence that any action be transparent to residents. The real power of the meeting wasn't the deed in my folder. It was the fact that the deed transformed an abstract complaint into a visible civic issue. It brought to light a tactic of subtle intimidation. And public visibility changes incentives. When neighbors are watching, those who make money by keeping things quiet lose their edge. In a narrow sense, the showdown had been successful because it had forced a conversation and exposed the board's covert operations. But it had also opened the door to a messier, more prolonged battle. They could litigate, they could try to record it again or challenge the title chain. They could mobilize fear. I had expected all of that. I had budgeted for it. I had prepared not for immediate vindication, but for a drawn-out correction. That night I slept differently. Not triumphant, not naive, simply alert and purposeful. The deed sat in a folder on my kitchen table like a small, cool stone. It was not the end. It was the hinge. The real test would be whether we, as a community, could choose fairness over fear, whether the instrument of ownership would be used to heal or to hurt. The board didn't waste time. Within a week, a thick envelope arrived, hand-delivered by courier instead of slipped into my mailbox. The company's name is embossed on the letterhead, which is made of heavy paper, and the paragraphs are written in intimidating legal language. Words like breach of covenant and temporary restraining order. I read each line slowly at my kitchen table. They asserted that the lot sale was inconsistent with the intent of the HOA's founding documents. They argued that the land was meant to be a common area, that my purchase threatened the integrity of the neighborhood. But beneath the formal phrasing, the real message was clear. We are scared, and we're trying to scare you back. I didn't panic. In this story, fear had already appeared, and I had gotten through it. Instead, I picked up the phone and called my attorney. He answered on the second ring, calm, steady, the kind of voice that could turn a storm into a weather report. "Send me the letter," he said. "Don't respond to them directly. Let me handle it." After scanning the document and sending it via email, I waited. He contacted me again hours later. "It's posturing," he explained. "They are granted management rights, not ownership, by their bylaws. Unless they can prove the deed was filed fraudulently, their chances are slim. They and the association stand to lose a lot of money if they fight." That was the crack I'd been waiting for. Fear only works when the target doesn't push back. It was now their turn to consider the price of war. Still, I knew this wasn't just a legal chess match. The battle was one of perception. If the board convinced the neighbors that I was selfish, dangerous, or greedy, I'd lose the community's support. And without their trust, even the cleanest deed in the world would feel like a curse. So I went on offense, not with lawsuits or threats, but with truth. I drafted a letter, not in legal jargon, but in plain words. I explained how I bought the lot. I stated the facts. The sale was legal, recorded, and enforceable. I explained why. The board had abused its authority and needed to be stopped. And then I added the most important part, my promise. This lot will remain open to all neighbors, without fines, without harassment. I will not use it as a weapon. I will use it to protect our community from intimidation. Just as they had done to me once, I printed copies and hid them under doors. Only this time the message wasn't fear. It was freedom. By the weekend I could feel the shift. Neighbors nodded at me in the street. A young couple stopped me on the sidewalk to thank me. Even those who had been skeptical admitted quietly that the board had gone too far. The balance of power was tilting. The board knew it. Their voices were tighter than usual, and their smiles were brittle at the subsequent meeting. They announced they were exploring legal options, but their words sounded hollow, defensive, almost desperate. And when residents stood up during the public comment section, it wasn't to complain about me. It was to question them. "Why are we spending money on lawsuits?" a neighbor inquired. "Why weren't we told this land could be sold in the first place?" asked another. For the first time, the board wasn't in control. They had been tried. That night I walked home through the quiet streets, porch lights glowing on either side. The air was cool, steady, and for the first time since this fight began, I realized something. I hadn't just bought a piece of land. I had restored the power balance. But I also knew that this wasn't over yet. Fear doesn't go away. Rather, it changes. And people who have ruled by intimidation don't surrender easily. The next action was approaching, and I was ready. Pressure does strange things to people. Some break, some get harder, and some, when they realize the ground beneath them is shifting, scramble to save themselves before it's too late. That was precisely what started taking place within the HOA board. At first, they tried to show that they were all in this together by signing letters and carefully rehearsing statements about protecting the integrity of the neighborhood. However, unity is fragile when fear enters, and they were already feeling fear from within. I began to hear whispers. A board member, one who had barely spoken during meetings, showed up at my door one evening. He looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot as though he expected someone to be watching. He said softly, "Look, I don't like the way things have been handled. I told them from the beginning the fines were going too far, but no one listened. And now, it's out of hand." He was invited in by me. He spoke in fragments, glancing at the window like every word might cost him. He told me about secret votes, about meetings that weren't properly recorded, about the chair pushing through fines to make examples out of people. It was never about order. It was about control. He spoke low. "They're panicking now. They are aware that the lawsuit will consume funds. They are aware that residents are opposing them. But the chair, he won't move. He'd rather burn it all than admit defeat." I listened, taking in every word. It confirmed what I already knew. The board wasn't a wall. It was a collection of people, and cracks had already begun to form. The next board meeting was different. Like static in the air, the tension was thicker and heavier. The number of neighbors in the room was higher than I'd ever seen before. People were angry now, not at me, but at them. One man stood up and said, "We pay dues to maintain the community, not to fund lawsuits you're destined to lose." Another woman added, "If you can't manage this fairly, maybe it's time for new leadership." Tree, under the weight of their own neighbors' voices, I observed the board tremble. They could not, for the first time, hide behind legal jargon or mailed notices. They were being referred to in public. The chair tried to regain control, pounding his gavel harder than necessary. "Order! This meeting will remain civil." But the louder he tried to command, the less power he seemed to hold. He was losing his once unquestioned authority like sand. I made an insignificant but significant observation that night. After the meeting ended, two board members didn't linger with the chair. They no longer huddled around him as they had before. Instead, they left quietly, almost avoiding eye contact. The cracks were getting bigger. And then came the petition. A group of neighbors, tired of the chaos, circulated papers calling for a recall vote. Signatures spread quickly, passed hand to hand, door to door. People who had once stayed silent now spoke openly about change. They were no longer afraid to speak. I hadn't tried to push it. I had not requested it. But the momentum had shifted all the same. The board no longer controlled the community. They were beginning to assert themselves once more. And that was when I realized my fight wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just about parking tickets, fines, or one obstinate man with a gavel. A rebellion against years of quiet intimidation had grown into something much larger. The situation had changed. However, tides do not only rise, they go down, and I was aware that the crash was coming. The petition worked more quickly than anyone anticipated. The number of signatures required for a recall vote was exceeded within 2 weeks. What began as whispered frustration had transformed into a movement, and suddenly the board that once thrived on fear found itself cornered by the very people it claimed to represent. The chair fought back the only way he knew how, with threats. He sent out letters declaring the petition invalid, citing obscure bylaws, inventing technicalities, clinging to the illusion of power. But no one bought it anymore. His words, once heavy with authority, now read like the tantrum of a man watching his grip slip away. The community center was full the day of the recall meeting. Every wall was lined with people, and every chair was taken. Even neighbors who usually stayed out of neighborhood politics came, drawn by the electricity of the moment. You could feel it in the air, a sense that something irreversible was about to happen. The chair opened the meeting with his usual pomp. He tried to project confidence, but his voice was trembling, a sign of the nerves he couldn't control. He lectured about unity and respect for process, as though the words could rewind months of intimidation. The room erupted when the floor was made available for discussion. A single mother stood and held up a stack of violation notices, her voice shaking with anger. Do you know what it feels like to come home from a 12-hour shift and find another fine taped to your door? Do you know what that does to someone who's already struggling? The next speaker was a former veteran. I didn't fight with clipboards and tape for petty tyrants. I fought for freedom. You abused your power. That's why we're here. Applause broke out. People cheered, not just for the words, but for the courage it took to say them. Neighbors stood and spoke one at a time. Stories of fines, harassment, and humiliation came out in the open. Stories that had once been whispered in private now rang out under the fluorescent lights. Every strike from the chair made them fall, but it sounded weaker and more desperate. He was no longer the man in control. He was a man drowning in the flood of truth. When the vote came, the result wasn't even close. Nearly every hand in the room rose in favor of removal. The chair's eyes darted around, searching for allies, but even his closest supporters sat frozen, unwilling to tie themselves to a sinking ship. He lost control of the gavel. It hit the table with a dull thud, and for the first time he didn't pick it back up. It was over. The board, once untouchable, had been dismantled in front of the very people it had tormented. The community cheered, not in chaos, but in relief. Neighbors hugged. Strangers shook hands. In a single evening, the weight that had been over the neighborhood for years was lifted. As I walked home that night, the air felt lighter, the street quieter in a way that was peaceful instead of oppressive. Porch lights glowed like beacons instead of watchtowers. I had fought with rage, stubbornness, and steadfast refusal to give in for months. But in the end, it wasn't just my deed or my defiance that toppled them. It was something bigger, a community that found its voice, a tide that rose higher than fear. What about the lot I bought? I left it open, no penalties, no cautions, no threats. Just space. Plain, honest space for neighbors to park without fear. A reminder that power doesn't come from paper or positions. It comes from people standing together. The HOA fined me for parking. So I bought the lot, and in the process, I bought back something more valuable: our freedom.